Welcome to The Long Game, Voices from the Health Front, a show about the people, ideas, and breakthroughs that are changing what it means to live healthier and longer. I'm your host, Shlomi Madar, CEO of Spot It Early, where we're building a multi-cancer early detection platform using man's best friend and AI. Today, I'm sitting down with Matthew Avery, partner at BakerBots in San Francisco, who has spent nearly 2 decades in the intersection of biotech engineering, FDA regulation, and intellectual property. He's quite an accomplished individual, as you will hear. And what brought us to this conversation and to Matt in general is the fact that he's one of the very few legal scholars in the country who has published on the regulatory and IP challenges of using dogs as medical diagnostics tools. This is, as you might imagine, something that is near and dear to our hearts at Spot It Early. So let's get into it. So first of all, Matt, it's a real pleasure to have you on our first episode. And before we get into the substance, maybe you can tell our viewers a little bit about yourself, because your background is very unique. It's not what most people would expect to hear when you say the words patent attorney. Please take it away.
Hey, Shlomi, thanks for the generous intro there. Great to be on the podcast here. Excited to talk a bit about, my research and what, how that is relevant to what you guys at Spotted Early are doing. As for my background, I'm here in the San Francisco Bay Area. My training originally was as a chemical engineer. So first at UC Berkeley and then Stanford for my master's. And after school, I worked for 4 years at Bayer Healthcare in their biotech headquarters here in Berkeley, California. And for them, I was a process engineer supporting their commercial scale biotech manufacturing facility. And we made recombinant factor VIII for treating hemophilia there. So very, very challenging molecule to make, one of the largest, if not the largest, biotech molecules manufactured on the market. What was great about working there is it gave me early exposure to how innovation moves from the lab to the scale-up process to a product, and helping assist the scientists at Bayer bring their stuff to market. But at some point, I decided that I was a little more interested in kind of like the professional side of things, and was looking at professional school, and I transitioned to law school. And I went to law school with the goal of staying close to science, because at heart, I was an engineer, really loved learning about new technology, but I was also really interested in working on the strategy side of things. And when I went to law school, I focused on intellectual property and also FDA regulatory issues. Even back then, I started doing research at the intersection of these areas and their intersection with science and commercialization. After law school, I graduated in 2009. So now getting close to 17 years, I've been at BakerBots my entire career. I'm a partner here now in our San Francisco office. Just a little background for the listeners. So BakerBots is a full-service international law firm with a focus on clients in the energy and technology spaces. And my practice is focused on what we call patent prosecution, which is kind of a weird term, but patent prosecution in the legal community means helping our clients get patents from the U.S. Patent Office. So I'm not a patent litigator. I'm not going to court and suing anyone. But rather I'm what they call prosecuting our patent applications in front of the patent office. And so I help my clients get patents to protect their inventions and help them figure out IP strategy more generally. And I do this for a variety of companies, from seed stage startups to Fortune 50 companies in both the high tech and life science spaces, and really help companies figure out how to build and leverage their patent portfolios. And then on top of that, just for fun, I also teach at the law school, previously called University of California, Hastings, and now renamed in the past few years to University of California College of the Law, San Francisco. And an adjunct, I've been teaching as an adjunct for 12 years, currently at UC Law and previously at Santa Clara Law. And I teach patent prosecution and food and drug law. and continue to research and publish on these areas as well. And my research is kind of continuing from what I started back in law school, focusing on these legal frameworks of how regulation affects innovation, particularly with life science companies and emerging technologies. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about some of my recent work in the fields of like animal-based diagnostics, where you guys are the experts in FDA regulation, and also empirical research on patent quality.
So maybe let's dive into the first topic. So speaking of the papers you've published, you predicted in 2020 that the FDA wasn't really ready for disease-sniffing dogs. So maybe you can summarize kind of your prediction from back then, and 6 years later, where do you think that things are actually standing right now?
Yeah. So I started doing research several years back on this issue of animal-based diagnostics. A few years before I met Udi and the rest of the Spotted Early team, who I think I've been working with since maybe 2021, if I remember correctly. But a few years before that, I got inspired to start looking in this space because I read a scientific article about some researchers, I believe they were in the United Kingdom, that were training dogs to go around hospitals to sniff patients for bacillus infections, which are particularly problematic when they spring up in hospitals and can kind of spread through the patient population there, and can be difficult to treat. It was fascinating research. The dogs were very effective in doing their job. But when I read this, coming from more of an FDA regulatory background, I thought to myself, like, well, what the dogs are doing sounds exactly like what you would normally buy, like an off-the-shelf, like in vitro diagnostic to do, where you take a sample from a patient and test them and see if they've got, some marker for a disease. And that would be something that obviously FDA or other, regulatory authorities in other countries would regulate as a medical device. But, as far as I knew at the time, FDA was not regulating animals, and certainly not animal-based diagnostics. And so I was really curious, like, what's FDA going to do here? What happens when someone tries to commercialize this and bring it to market? And I started diving into the research there, and it was really fascinating to look into this area. And so eventually I came up with a framework based on my research for what I think, or what I thought at the time the regulatory framework would look like, and what I thought FDA might do, and got that published in Georgetown's Food and Drug Law Journal. And so that got published, I believe, back in mid-2020, kind of at the height of the pandemic, which was a timely period for it to get published, because also at the time, there were other companies out there looking at training dogs to do COVID detection, which was, trying to come up with any type of diagnostic to detect COVID was super important at that time frame back in mid-2020. Before now, of course, we have tons of COVID diagnostics that you can just go down to the local drugstore and buy one. But back then, you may remember we had to like drive over to some central testing station and get a sample taken from us, and it gets sent in, and you get a result back days, weeks later, who knows? And it was quite a hassle. So if you could just train a dog to walk around and sniff people and alert if someone had COVID, that seemed like a huge innovation. And there was at least a couple companies that I was aware of that were looking into this, and that I talked to. And it was very interesting at the time. FDA basically said that, hey, what you guys are doing is really cool. We encourage you to keep doing it, but we are not ready to really regulate in this area because this is basically like really different from what we look at normally. But we encourage you to keep doing it, and if you keep going forward, here are some things you may want to think about. And so seeing FDA come out and say that, it basically aligned with what I had predicted in my paper. and in terms of them highlighting kind of unique issues related to animal-based diagnostics that they wanted sponsors to pay attention to. And I believe that this is kind of the same areas where you are still seeing kind of challenges and probably regulatory authorities coming back to you with questions about the products that you guys are making.
Yeah, that's still indeed the case. I do have to say that you see more companies that are actually using different types of animals. So you have mammals. People are using mice and rats. Mammals have a great sense of smell, I should say, but there are also other organisms. So you have different types of crustaceans. I've seen ants and bees and grasshoppers. All of them are the same. They're all, I would say, maybe pose different challenges to regulate. But I think the benefit from using those animals is just a level of sensitivity, which, despite 4 decades of research, I don't think as an industry we can really recapitulate the ability of millions of years of evolution. So, yeah, I would definitely want to see regulation actually stepping in and telling us what we can do as opposed to what's, we don't want to even hear about. And I have to say, when I first had my interaction with spotted tail, it was more than 3 years ago. As a molecular biologist, I was a bit of a skeptic. But then when you see the results, right, they just published their interim results, which were double blinded. You just cannot argue with the numbers. So if the data and the science is there, I think that the regulation should step in, and we hope that this is what we'll see in the near future. We're just two guys talking, so we cannot really influence them.
Yeah.
But great, that was a great paper, and I think very predictive when you
Yeah.
think about it.
Yeah, I think that 100% agree with you. Like the technology is incredible and clearly something that is going to have, I think great clinical utility. And something that we should be encouraging, an area where we should be encouraging research, and the regulatory agencies like FDA clearly have a role to play in encouraging that type of research to happen. And I feel like with companies in this space and with companies like Spotted Early, right, that this is one of the big hurdles that you have to overcome in terms of being a barrier to commercialization. That, FDA clearly has regulatory authority here, but they're not providing a clear framework that you or other companies can follow in terms of how do we get this animal-based diagnostic to the market? What's it going to take to get FDA to give you a thumbs up to let you start marketing and selling this technology? And I think the big challenge is that FDA is going to look at regulating this like an animal when really it should be regulated is more like a diagnostic platform, right? And there are certainly challenges that come from the fact that you're using animals within your platform. So like animal to animal variability, of course, like you have to account for that, or training variability, right? You have to account for that, or ongoing validation of the animals, right, as they age, right? How do you know the performance of the animal is maintained as the animal ages, right? These are all obviously unique challenges to animal-based diagnostics that would differ from kind of like your standard chemical, mechanical type device where, more easily figure out like standardization and reproducibility and manufacturing controls. So, but what's manufacturing controls mean when you're talking about an animal, right? Like, I don't even know how you translate traditional, FDA concepts of like manufacturing controls to, animal training. And so, it's clearly a really challenging space, but I mean, my opinion is that FDA should be working a little harder and I think stepping in and trying to help companies in this space with some more guidance on, this is what we expect in order for you to kind of satisfy the criteria that we're going to want to see in order to get these products approved for marketing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. And I agree with you. I think the big challenges, I think the is one of the reasons, because there's 20 years worth of studies that show that dogs can sniff cancer and other diseases as well, but no one really scaled that solution, right? No, you don't see any product out there in the market that's actually utilizing dogs as biological sensors. I think now what's changing, and this is kind of my 2 cents, I agree with you that the question is, how do you control a variability that is inherent, right, to a pack of dogs sniffing a disease and to their training? But I think there are good answers now, and it's coming from two components. First is the technology. So we're using multiple sensors to monitor the dogs, both behavioral and physiological signals. But I think even more importantly, it's AI. It can really control for the variance. So it can actually measure the base behavior, base signals of each dog, and then look for the deviation and quantify it. So I think there are answers there. Definitely, you need to standardize it, but so long as you can control kind of the reproducibility of your platform, it should be the gold standard, like you would measure any other platform. Again, I'm
Yeah.
trying to maybe a little bit oversimplify, but I do think that if the regulation will dip their toes into it, they will find that you can actually be in a more quantifiable place than what was available even 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting that you bring up AI, right? And I think that's a good analogy, right? And that, FDA should not be thinking about this as like, I'm trying to get an animal approved as a diagnostic necessarily and trying to regulate each individual animal. I think this is more analogous to perhaps what FDA is doing in trying to regulate AI, where, the same input into an AI model may in fact have some variance in the output, right? But FDA understands that and has provided guidance to people in the medical software space on AI based tools on here's how you account for that. And the FDA understands that you regulate the AI model pipeline, not each individual inference by the model, right? And so I think that is
Exactly.
a good analogy to what you guys are doing, and hopefully the direction that FDA will eventually move.
Great. So let's switch gears from regulation to intellectual property. And you had a paper in 2025, I believe, where you talked about the framework for
Hmm.
patenting working animals. Kind of, you laid out 7 category approaches. And I think what struck me reading it was a finding that the trained animal itself is essentially unpatentable. So
Right.
I would appreciate if you can tell us more about that and where does the protection actually sits.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's, at first I think there's a common misconception that, you can't patent animals. And I think that's not quite right. So I think the real answer is you can't generally patent the animal itself, but you can build strong IP around how the animal is, for example, trained or used or integrated into a platform, for example, like a disease diagnostics system. And I think for animal-based inventions, that's what you want to look at. And so for you guys, you're using dogs. Those already exist in nature. In terms of patenting the animal itself, you probably can't do that. But you are doing a lot of other interesting things there with your technology, where there is definitely things that you can patent and capture some IP value for your company. So, I think in short, like the value from an IP perspective is not the dog, it's the system around the dog. It's the training protocols, these detection methods, sample handling workflows, and like your hardware and software interfaces. So all of those things are areas where you can definitely, things that didn't already exist in nature, where you can capture IP and get some value.
Great. So yeah, thank you for that. And staying within the IP world, you also had another Harvard study called The Myth of Bad Patents. That's a really interesting read. And we just talked about it right before the podcast started. But I think it's very insightful because you did look at over 80,000 patents. And I think you found something there that goes against kind of the common beliefs of founders. At least for me, it was illuminating. So let's say you talk to a biotech founder who's building their first portfolio. What should they kind of glean from your research? What was most interesting there?
In the life sciences industry, it's fundamentally different from other types of technologies like consumer tech or software, where you're incurring massive upfront R&D costs before you're generating any revenue. So once your product gets to market, in order to protect your ability to generate that revenue and prevent copycats that are just going to free ride, the hard work that you've done, you need some type of intellectual property, usually patents, in order to, protect, yourself, your product, and give you a time frame to capture some revenue and get back your R&D costs. And in the life science field, R&D costs are so high because of things like high failure rates, long timelines that are measured in years, not months, to get, product to market. And as we were just talking about, significant regulatory risks. As for the role of patents here, they're not just, helpful. I would argue that they're structurally necessary for biotech and life science company founders. And that what you really need to be worried about is competitors that might be free riding on your work immediately after you validate the idea. And in the worst case scenario, you see certain fields where after patents expire, you can see the innovator lose 80-90% of their market share, perhaps within months. And so arguably the entire economic value of the innovation that you come up with is concentrated in this patent window. So, for life science companies, patents aren't really a defensive tool. They're the mechanism that makes the entire business model viable. So as for, what my research is showing in this paper in Harvard's Tech Law Journal is, what makes a patent actually strong, a patent of high quality. And what we're thinking about here from like what's a high quality patent or a good patent is one that is, if it does get litigated, will be found to still be valid by the court and found to be infringed. And those two things are necessary if you're actually going to extract value from your patent. It needs to remain valid and be found infringed. So there is a common intuition that I have come across talking to people working on patents and also, even founders, this concept that, more examination time at the patent office, more back and forth with the patent office is going to lead to a better, stronger patent. I've talked to colleagues in life science companies where their intuition was that having a lot of rejections from the patent office before it gets allowed is kind of a signal that this is like a gold-plated patent, is how I've heard it described, which was really interesting. And that like, hey, look how rigorous the patent office was in examining this. It now must be really good, and I can go take that out and be confident that it's going to be found valid later if it were ever to be litigated. But what our research showed is that this common wisdom actually was not correct, in that the more rejections that you get from the patent office apparently makes your patent slightly weaker, makes it slightly more likely to get invalidated. And so this, of course, is a great example of like, research raising more questions than answers, or leading to more questions than answers. So it was interesting to find out that answer. Of course, then the follow-up is like, why is that true? What explains that? And in my leading theory, and it's something that we're investigating now with some subsequent research, and maybe in a year from now, I'll have some answers for you. But my leading theory is that getting more rejections from the patent office is likely a signal that you are trying to get a patent in a more crowded prior art space. And that is why you keep getting more and more rejections from the patent office, because this prior art space is crowded, it's relatively easy for the patent office to just find new prior art to cite against you. And you make an amendment, and then they come back with a new rejection with more prior art because it's so easy for them to find more prior art. And that if you're able to get a patent more quickly, that is maybe a signal that you're operating in more of a greenfield space that's less crowded, less competitive. So don't have a definitive answer on if that is what's actually happening, but we think that's what's happening. But the bigger takeaway from the research is that every amendment you make to get a patent allowed is a trade, in that you may be buying an allowance, but you might also be weakening your patent in the long term if it ever gets allowed. One caveat there, of course, is that like every patent is unique and should be evaluated on its own merits. But from our research, we looked at thousands and thousands of litigated patents, and so there's certainly some value and guidance to be drawn from the general trends that we saw there.
Yeah, so what doesn't kill you makes you weaker, would be.
Yeah, a little weaker, right? But it's shocking because everyone just assumed like, oh yeah, it should make you stronger. So even if it's only a little bit weaker, it's significant because it's cutting against what we all assume should be true.
Yeah, well, that was very, very insightful. All right, so Matt, are you ready for the lightning round?
Lightning round, sure, I'm ready.
All right, so let's start with the first one. What gives you the most hope right now?
Gives me the most hope. That is a good question. That is a tough one. I am kind of an eternal optimist, and no matter the challenging times that I or the nation or the world may be going through, I'm just a strong believer in human human innovation and our ability to find solutions to problems and eventually arc towards something better. So I don't know. I think what always gives me hope is just believing in the ability of people and myself to make things better.
Great. All right, so the next one is, what is the one thing about healthcare that most people get wrong?
Boy, so I'm teaching food and drug law this semester, and it's really interesting talking to my students about this, and they come in with their own preconceived notions. But I think the one that maybe shocks the most people is the actual costs of healthcare in the United States. This, of course, is going to be very different from the rest of the world, where in most developed countries you have single-payer healthcare. But here we've got this complicated model of insurance companies and some government paying and then some out of pocket by the consumer, and it's a big mess. And everyone complains about drugs in particular being particularly expensive, but I think when you look at the real numbers, that is not, in fact, true. That, the larger healthcare costs are coming from hospital stays and a surprisingly large amount coming from insurance overhead. I think, I'm not sure if this is a true statement, but I think from numbers I've seen, if you just replaced all private insurance with like single payer healthcare, you'd save enough money to essentially make all drugs like free or almost free, which I think blows most people's minds. Yeah. So cost of healthcare, I think most people don't have a good perspective on what it actually costs.
Great. It's supposed to be a lightning round. We can do a whole podcast just on that topic, and maybe we will.
I know.
All
I would
right,
love
let's
to
go
listen to
something
that when you talk to a real expert in that area.
Oh, I think you have enough of perspective. Let's try to end on a positive note. And if you have kind of one sentence, one positive sentence to describe the future of health, from your perspective, you are exposed to a lot of innovation. How do you see us moving forward in this space?
Yeah, moving forward. So I will frame this maybe in like the patent and regulatory context, right? And in that the innovation that I'm privileged to see on a on a day-to-day basis is incredible. And I'm super lucky that my job is basically talking to innovators like you and your scientists and learning about the cool new stuff they're working on. And it's honestly inspiring. And so I'm just kind of like inspired every day in terms of the direction that I see technology in all areas moving, and it's incredible what you see coming down the pipeline. And the caveat with that, I think, particularly in life science companies and in these heavily regulated spaces, sometimes regulation is a barrier rather than being helpful. And so that the regulatory agencies can catch up to where you guys are, and help you actually, bring the cool new stuff to market so that we can all benefit from it.
Great. And it's great to finish the episode on a high note. So that's all for today's episode of The Long Game, Voices from the Health Front. Thank you so much, Matt. It was great. And for the viewers, if you want to learn more about what we're building at Spot It Early, please head to spotitearly.com. And if you wish to join our journey, please visit spotitearly.com/invest. We'll see you next time.